You're such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a survival story of the 9-year kidnapping of Fusako Sano. And this is a case unlike any I have ever researched. I mean, the deception, the theories, the fingers that were pointed in many different directions. And all I can say is that these survival stories really show how strong humans can be. And I think that it is something we need to hear right now. So if it is a series you want me to continue, please make sure to give this a thumbs up, because as you guys know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean, no harm or disrespect when I do so. And if you want to support me, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, thumbs up this video, and leave a nice comment down below. Now, I also want to give a huge thank you to Abnormal Japan podcast. They are actually a podcast who did this case, but they also live in Japan, so they know a little bit about the culture and things that would only happen in Japan, or explanations on why certain things were done at this time in this area. And that's really helpful, considering I wouldn't know those things from online resources that I can find here in America. So I'm going to give a huge shout out to them. As always, their episode will be linked down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1990 in Japan, and this Sano family lived in a place called Sanjo. And again, I want to apologize for any pronunciations that I completely butcher. I truly do not mean any harm by not saying them correctly. I just simply have a hard time with it. But their daughter was a 9-year-old girl named Fusako, who was born in 1981, and she was the perfect little schoolgirl. She was actually a 4th grader in elementary school, and she loved to hang out with her friends, do her schoolwork, and she loved to watch sport games. And in fact, she would often do so after school, where she would get to hang out with her friends. She was sweet, she was innocent, and she was young. And on November 13th, she went to school. It was a regular day, and she had actually waited after school to go to this baseball game that was still on the property in the schoolyard. And she went with other friends, she watched for a while, and she left in good spirits, probably saying goodbye to her friends before walking away and towards her home. That wasn't too far away, so she could still walk there and be safe. She had done this many times, and it was quite normal for kids to be walking in Japan at this time alone. And a lot of the times younger kids did walk in groups, but Fusako had walked alone before, and she figured she would be okay. Unfortunately, as we know by this story, that wasn't the case. After this, she wouldn't pop up anywhere at all. In fact, somewhere during her walk from the school to her house, she vanished without a trace, and nobody could find her or any evidence of a struggle. Now, her family was a hard-working family that worked on a rice plant or rice paddy, and they were extremely diligent with their time and with what they did in a day, because they were working for their money. And so they really did know when Fusako didn't come home, because she had needed to come home and do her homework and then work and help them. And so as soon as she was late, they contacted the police saying that she was missing. A large search was put together because they believed that she would be found in no time. It was such a short distance that she would have been walking, so she had to be along that trail somewhere, or evidence of where she went or her being there should be found at least. So they put together this search quickly, and they thought it would be as simple as that. But it wasn't at all. They were very wrong in all of their assumptions, because if she was a runaway, she didn't want to be found. And if somebody had taken her, they had done so quickly without leaving any evidence. The police didn't automatically think that she was a runaway, which is quite strange in these cases. As we all know, with young children and teenagers, that's the automatic theory. And if not that, it is automatically to a kidnapping, by someone in the area, by possibly a predator in the area, or a criminal who's just gotten out, or, broke out. However, that wasn't what the police's theory was automatically. They actually believed that Fusako had been kidnapped by North Korean intelligence operatives. And that was a crazy theory to throw out there as their first one. However, it wasn't actually all that crazy. You see, in the 1970s and 80s, it was said that hundreds to thousands of people from Japan and South Korea were actually abducted by these operatives on the orders of Kim Jong, who would send people over basically to grab these individuals and keep them as hostages in North Korea so that they could teach these North Korean spies their language and how to better fit in so they were better spies. Most of these victims have never been found, and the lucky few families will occasionally get photos of them sent from North Korea saying that these people, their children or their spouse or whoever it was that was kidnapped, is still alive. However, the chances of them actually coming back in contact with them is very slim, and a lot of these victims are thought to have already died from either the torture or the situations that they are in or what they are put through. And so a lot of them do not return home. Although the government in both South Korea and Japan have worked really hard on trying to bring these different individuals home, they have not yet found a way to safely do so. So I know that at the time of this case in the 1990s, they still had no idea how to stop this and how to get these victims out of the hands of these captors. But this is something that was a huge concern at the time, that this was still happening and that possibly Fusako was a victim of them. And for the police to be saying this, it meant that they believed her case would be automatically a dead end from the start because there was nothing they could do. So they could label it a North Korean abduction, meaning they would no longer have to search. They would not have to come up with any answers. It would be technically unsolved, but not really. And so nobody would be able to say they didn't do their jobs because this is just what happened. So this was absolutely devastating for the Sanos, who knew that if they labeled this a North Korean abduction, there was no chance of getting their daughter back. They didn't know if this is what happened to her or not, but they didn't want them to stop searching. However, it did seem like this could be possible because there was no ransom demands ever made. There was no sign of what happened to her. She simply just vanished, and she hadn't returned for many, many years. No sign of her at all had come about in that time. And it was also found that where she vanished was on the edge of the Sea of Japan, which is a direct path to North Korea. And this is where a lot of people were said to vanish right off that edge and be taken. The official count of missing from Japan and confirmed to be taken by North Korea between 1977 and 1983 was 17 individuals in 6 years, and those were only the confirmed ones that were known to be hostages. However, there were many, many more people that were thought to have had this happen to them, but it just hadn't been confirmed. No pictures of them had been released as being hostages, and no evidence was found linking them to North Korea. Japan talk shows were constantly talking about Fusako's case in hopes that it would bring in more tips, considering the police had just kind of given up on it and said there was nothing more they could do in the investigation. And so they would constantly put her picture out there and they would talk about it, but this wasn't bringing in any more tips. The Sano family knew where the police stood in this case. They knew that they were going to get no help from investigators, and of course they were devastated. It was pretty much the equivalent of them saying, your daughter's dead and there's nothing we will do. There's no justice that we will give her. You simply will never see her again. But they would be very wrong about this, and her family had to wait many years to find out that this wasn't the truth. They had grieved the loss of their daughter, her possible murder or death. But 10 years later, they would find out what really happened, and everything would change. It was now January 28th of 2000, and the Sanos would get a call from investigators saying that their daughter had been found. It was a call they never expected, and they believed at this point that meant that her body had been found. And even at that, they were happy to have been able to lay her to rest and give her a proper funeral. But then they were told, no, your daughter is alive. You see, Fusako was found in a hospital where she had told an officer, I was abducted near the school by a man who forced me into a car. For 9 years, I did not take a step out of the house. Today, I went out for the first time. Now, Fusako had no injuries, but she was hospitalized for dehydration and exhaustion. She was extremely thin and could barely walk, and she also had a horrible case of jaundice where her skin was basically turning yellow from lack of sunlight. She was so pale. She was now 19 years old, but she still acted as if she was 9, the age when she was abducted. Her mental state really did not seem to age with her. And, this will make a bit more sense when we get into what she had gone through all of those years. Now, once she was treated at the hospital, her family was able to come and visit her, and they were so shocked at the woman in front of them. Her mother didn't even recognize her at first because the last image she had of her own daughter was 10 years prior. A little 9-year-old girl, and now a woman was sitting in front of her. And this is something that I think many people can be confused about. How did she not recognize her own daughter? But, I can tell you from personal experience that when you lose somebody, they kind of stick in your mind looking and acting exactly like they did when you last saw them. Now, when my parents did foster care and so many children would leave us, I can still remember them as babies, as little children, and they never really grew up in my mind. They never really aged at all because I couldn't see that version of them. All I saw was the baby that they left us as. And so to see someone grown after that's your last image of them, it can be absolutely baffling to the point where your brain cannot handle it because you didn't watch that progression. There's suddenly this person in front of you, and in your mind, time had stopped. But it didn't take long for her mother to acknowledge that it was her daughter and to adjust, and she called out her name, she ran over, and she hugged her. Fusako hugged her back immediately, and at this point, she went home to her family to readjust to the life she should have been living all along. And in the investigation, it was released that she had been found. However, nobody had yet known how she got to the hospital, who she was with, or where she had been. Everything was kept pretty secret at first. However, investigators would be going to a home 600 yards from the police station that had been investigating her case this entire time to search inside, because this was allegedly where she had been kept this entire time. No arrests were made at first, which was baffling to the public, because there was also a 45-member investigative team that was put together on this case to help figure out what had happened, and yet this abductor had still not been taken into custody. But that would come soon enough. You see, Fusako wanted nothing to do with the media. In fact, she wanted to stay in her home, not speak to anyone so she could heal, and I think that that was the best thing for her to do for herself. But unfortunately, she did have to tell police what had happened, even though it was right after she had gotten out of the situation. They had to know so they could possibly stop this man or this person from doing it again. So that is when the full story would come out to everyone, the press, the public, and everyone would find out what had happened the day she disappeared and every day after. You see, she had said that that day 9 years ago when she was walking home by herself, a man had pulled up next to her and forced her into his trunk at knife point. She had no other choice to get in. She was 9 years old, she was terrified, and she did as she was told. She would then be taken 34 miles to a home where she would be ushered in, taken to the second floor, and tied up by her arms and her legs. This was by some sort of strong tape, and she was in a bedroom with very little sunlight. She was threatened with beatings and a stun gun if she yelled, if she tried to get away, if she did anything that this man did not want her to do. She was restricted like this for months, unable to move from this position, unable to do anything for herself. She said that at first she tried to escape, but she was too afraid to do so. She was a child. She had no idea even how to get away, or if it would work, or what would happen if she didn't. So she just stayed, and eventually she was too exhausted to even try. Anytime she moved or talked, this man would either use a stun gun on her or put a knife up to her to make her scared enough to not want to do it again. She was ordered to never touch the door at all, and she was also in this little square in the room that had tape around her, basically confining her into this certain area, saying she could not get out. It was already a tiny bedroom, but this area was a place she couldn't move from either. She said that she had stayed quiet to help her from not being beaten, but she would sit there for days, weeks, months, talking to nobody except for the thoughts in her head and doing nothing but sitting there. This man would cut her hair short anytime it got long. He would also dress her in men's clothing, obviously to make her look more like a boy, to conceal her identity. And she was only allowed to bathe every once in a while. I mean, like, this was possibly once a month, once every few months, because there wasn't a bathroom in this room. She had to go downstairs to do so. And if she wasn't allowed to bathe, I wonder how she went to the bathroom. That meant that going to the bathroom was not a given right for her anymore. It was a privilege, and a lot of the times she just had to go in that very spot she was confined to. She wasn't allowed to watch TV or do anything at all. So she stared around the room, wondering if this would be her life forever. Eventually she was allowed to touch the TV, but only to record the horse races that her abductor wanted her to. But if she forgot or she didn't do it correctly, she would be beaten horrendously. So it was almost an anxiety-ridden activity for her to even do that, because she knew that she had to do it perfectly. At this point, she would be allowed to listen to the radio every once in a while, and after 8 years had gone by, she was finally able to watch some TV. If she was good. Now, the windows around her in this room were thick and they were blurry. She wasn't able to see outside, nobody was able to see inside, and this was said to be a window called a privacy window in Japan that oftentimes are in houses, but that also meant that no one would be able to save her because they couldn't see what was happening inside. It also meant there was no sunlight streaming in, and she hadn't seen the sun in years. Now, Fusako was given food once to 3 times a day to eat. She didn't know if the meals were gonna come. She didn't know when. And she always just hoped that she would be fed that day. And it was normally instant microwavable food or home-cooked meals. But she didn't know who was cooking these, if it was her abductor, somebody else, or if it was takeout he was putting on a plate. But every once in a while it was much better than this microwavable food. But she also said that she knew that the door wasn't locked, but she was too scared at first to try it, and then she had too little energy to even want to get up and do anything. It was said that she was not only confined physically, but that her soul was in chains. Now there was this man under psychiatric observation at this hospital that Fusako was found at, and that is when she would talk to the police. But why, after 9 years of never leaving the house, did these two finally show up somewhere? Why was Fusako taken to this hospital? Well, at first, when the police realized that they had a kidnapping victim in front of them, they hadn't even thought to interrogate this man she had been with, because they didn't, think that this could even be possible, that this was this girl who was gone for 9 years. So they didn't even look at him. They were just talking to her, trying to figure out all the information. When they finally realized that he was an abductor, that is when they would begin to look more into him. He was found to be 37-year-old Nobuyuki Sato, and he had a home in a residential area that was 600 yards from the police station, this home that they had searched. Now, they quickly realized that this wasn't necessarily his home. It actually belonged to his mother, but he had been living there. You see, he was unemployed, he was living with his mother, and he was almost 40. Police would then go talk to his mother, who lived in this home with them, and said, how did she not know that there was a girl living there, or did she? And she said that she did not, that she had no idea anyone else was in the home at all. Although there were much darker parts to this story that I haven't told you yet. So we are going to dive deep into that. You see, Nobuyuki was not a gentle being, and he often had rages where he would turn extremely violent towards his mother prior to all of this. In fact, she would often have broken windows and doors and bruises all over her body. And this was actually said to ramp up even more the year after Nobuyuki's father had passed, and he was 27 years old, and his mother would often be seen with wounds all over her, and no one helped her, even when she asked. I heard a lot of sources talking about Nobuyuki's father's death as being a trigger for him that caused him to be violent, that caused him to do this kidnapping. And although yes, a trauma, a tragedy, a death can trigger you into this sort of state that is unlike yourself, or that can be violent or angry, I saw a lot of people kind of using it as an excuse for Nobuyuki's behavior. But the year after all of this with his mom, that's when he took Fusako. It seems to me that he liked to have this feeling of power because he did feel so helpless after his father died, and that he knew he loved to hurt women. As awful as that sounds, I think he got almost addicted to it, and he began to feel that he needed to do it. However, he couldn't always do it to his mother because she was providing everything for him. A place to live, a place to have something to eat. And so, what was the solution in his eyes? To have somebody else to torture. And that is when he picked up a 9-year-old girl. 6 years into the abduction, he was actually getting even worse towards Fusako and towards his mother. And his mother was 73 years old, a fragile elderly woman at this point. And, she said she didn't know Fusako was even there, but she decided to contact the public health area or center in the area for her own safety, because she was terrified of what her son would do to her. She said she feared her son would do something horrible, that he was acting strange, and she had called for help. Yet no one did anything about this. They didn't come visit her, they didn't ask her further questions. They talked to her one time and let it be at that. So it would be 4 years later when his mother would get the courage to call again and ask for further help, because things were only escalating from there. His mother was so beaten down emotionally, mentally, and physically that she knew that calling was the only option at this point, or she might be dead soon enough. Little did she know, or maybe she did, that there was another victim in that house that was feeling the exact same way. It was now January 12th of 2000, and her mother would try again, calling and saying that she was terrified of her son and begging for someone to come and rescue her. However, everyone thought that her being scared of her son was a ridiculous thing. So they would leave it at that. They would say to call back in a week, and maybe they could help her then. Not even caring how critical timing is in an abusive situation. Obviously not knowing the proper protocol or ways to handle this at all. Or maybe they didn't care, but on January 19th, she had to call again. They didn't even check on her. She called once again, and still it took 19 more days for a social worker to finally come to her house to check things out. Nobuyuki was actually in such a horrible rage when they got there that they were so terrified. These social workers that had at first said there was nothing wrong, they didn't need to be there, they were now terrified of him and called the police themselves because he was so out of control. It was said that Nobuyuki had gotten so riled up because his mother had tried to go in his bedroom, and he didn't want that at all. When the police finally arrived, they would find Fusako in his bedroom. They forced their way in, even though Nobuyuki was demanding that they didn't enter. They forced their way in and found her in a horrible condition, and with him still raging, they couldn't talk to him about who she was or why she was there, so the two of them were taken to the hospital, and Nobuyuki was put into a psychiatric hospital for testing at this point, while Fusako was getting medical treatment. And that is when police would realize that a horrific case had been solved, because a kidnapping victim was right in front of them. But the main question that investigators had was, did this mother know that Fusako had been there the entire time? How did she not know the girl was upstairs? She was now cooking for 3 instead of 2. She was the one making the home-cooked meals that Fusako had no idea where they were coming from. She was also found to have purchased feminine hygiene products at some point because her son had asked her to. Was this just something that she did whatever he asked and didn't ask any more questions? Or did she know and was too scared? She also said she was never allowed upstairs into his bedroom even before all of this of the abduction, so it wasn't any different when he started to say she couldn't go up there, wasn't allowed in his bedroom, because that's how it always had been. But I almost wonder if Fusako is why his mother continued to try to get help. I know that a lot of abuse victims can feel that they don't deserve to get help or that nobody will help them, so they stop trying, and especially if they're turned down the first few times, they just kind of give up and feel like they deserve it, which is the complete opposite of the truth. But I know that a lot of victims, when somebody else is in this situation, they can almost feel protective over that other person, and even if they don't think that they deserve to be out of it, they will believe that the other person does, and they don't want them to continue to suffer, so they continue to try. Maybe his mother had heard Fusako crying at one point, or maybe they even talked while he was out of the house, and they kind of had a bond over their mutual fear of him, and his mother was trying to call to get her out of the situation without directly saying that she knew what was happening. Maybe that's why the police were called that day. Maybe that's why she was trying to get into his room, because she finally had had enough and was telling him to let that girl go. Because for her to be going into this room when she never had before, when she knew it was off limits, that was very risky for her to be doing, and she knew it would cause a rage. Maybe she was trying to help Fusako escape because she knew that he would not release her. I just know that from the kidnapping cases that I've looked into where there are more than one victims, these victims can grow accustomed to what they have been enduring for many years, like his mother, who had just, known that this is how her son was and didn't feel like she could get out of it anymore. But when a new victim is thrown into it, they finally kind of snap back to reality and knowing that it isn't okay and knowing that these people deserve better. I mean, we saw this in the Steven Stainer case that I did, where he was locked up for years and he was also able to come and go as he pleased, but he never tried to contact his family, and he just did as he was told because that was his new reality. However, when another little boy was brought into the picture, that is when they escaped. I think that could be the scenario here, but I almost do think that Fusako and his mother kind of had a trauma bond, like we talked about in the Abby Hernandez case, where they felt a comfort with each other and they almost thrived off having one another in this toxic environment, and kind of fed off of one another in a way. But at the same time, if that was the case, if a trauma bomb was happening, did his mother possibly want to keep Fusako there to have somebody else to either talk to or to lessen her beatings? Because obviously if there's two, she's going to be hurt less. And as horrible as that is, could that have been what happened? Was she possibly okay with her being there, which is why she didn't do anything about it for 9 years? It was 9 years later, and Fusako was now safe, away from her captor or captors, and this was actually the longest kidnapping of its kind in Japan. And although Fusako was away from all of this, mentally she would never be the same. The trauma she endured would live with her forever. She was suffering from PTSD. She had been in captivity for so long and since such a young age that a lot of the social skills that a lot of people develop while they're in their teens and growing up, she had missed out on those. So she was really lacking in social development, and this caused her to have a lot of problems making friends and, going to school. And that is why she did not have the maturity level or the, mental age that she was, because for 9 years she barely talked to anyone. So of course, she's still going to be in that same mindset as she was when she was abducted, because she never experienced anything else. However, I will say that trauma does age you. So I think, a lot of these media sites were saying she never aged. She was still 9 years old, and she may have been immature in some ways, but I think in others, she was probably extremely mature. Even for a 19-year-old, she was probably wise beyond her years in ways that a lot of people can't see. I think, maybe she was a little socially awkward in that way and immature. But I think in ways of surviving and in ways of mental strength, she was probably stronger than most of us could ever even fathom. And now she was having to make up for all of those years that she had lost. After being released from the hospital, when her body had recovered, she actually joined the rest of her family by working on a rice paddy, and she worked really hard. She was quiet on a day-to-day basis. She liked to take a lot of long walks by herself just to think, and she did make a few friends during this time, which was really good for her. She did like to spend a lot of time alone though, and she loved photography. She especially loved to photograph flowers. She also got a driver's license, which, of course she should have gotten years ago, but she hadn't got to do that before, but she did now, which was really cool. And she also loved soccer and would attend a lot of the games in the area. And not much more is known about Fusako and how she was after all of this. She really wanted to be with her family and to live as normally as possible. And I do think that for her, if that's what she wanted, I'm glad that was given to her. She deserves that after all of this, but she does truly seem to be grateful for her life and her freedom every single day. But what happened to her abductor? Well, at first he was in the psychiatric treatment center and he was deemed mentally unstable. But by February 11th, he was actually arrested in the kidnapping of Fusako. Unfortunately, in Japan at this time, kidnapping was not looked at as a big deal at all. And if he did get any time in prison, it wouldn't be much. So they decided to charge him with a bunch of random little things that he could have possibly done before that was on his criminal record, such as shoplifting women's underwear, such a minute thing that they had to add on so his sentence would be at least a little long. He would plead insanity, which would push back the trial for a year, but then he was found mentally fit to face the charges, and at this point he would also plead guilty and admit what he had done. It also was found at this time that Nobuyuki was not a one-time offender. In fact, he had done something like this before. You see, a year prior to Fusako being kidnapped, he had been arrested for conflicting violence on a young girl and attempting to kidnap her. This was on June 3rd of 1989, and he was actually convicted for this. Now, though I couldn't find how long he was in prison, he would obviously be out 14 months later on probation and would be free enough to abduct another girl. Oddly enough, his records didn't show that he had ever been in prison for this at all, because investigators had looked at all the criminals in the area when Fusako had gone missing, and he was not on that list. At the trial, I will say the prosecutors were really trying to look out for Fusako's mental health, and they didn't make her relive everything and go through that trauma at all. They really tried to lessen the amount that she had to think about and, relive. And Nobuyuki would end up looking like he could have been sentenced for 15 years. That was the maximum that they could have given him. It wasn't a lot, but it was even more baffling when he would actually be sentenced with 14 years instead. They didn't even give him the full amount. This was actually dropped to 11 on appeal because it was said he was weak-minded at the time of the crime. However, the Japanese Supreme Court did reinstate it for 14 years. Even 14 years meant that he was only locked up for 5 years more than Fusako was at his home. For all those years she was tortured, he would only get 5 more years in prison. Nobuyuki also complained that this was all infringing on his human rights, and he was actually only held in solitude in prison for 250 days, which was nothing compared to what Fusako had gone through. We see this a lot in the trials of kidnappings. The fact that these abductors don't get a ton of time. I do believe that that's simply because people don't want to acknowledge the amount of mental abuse and trauma and how that can affect humans. I think you look at the damage of a person physically, or the fact that they're still alive and you think that everything's fine. They were returned home. What's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal in many ways that is invisible to the human eye. Her family was devastated in this outcome of the trial, but they were also becoming familiar with the injustices in the criminal justice system. I mean, her father said that no matter the outcome of the trial, they would still have anger and regret, and there would still be no healing from the hurt that had deprived his family from the happiness found in a normal home. They were absolutely angry. He said there was no way to regain the 9 years, 2 months, and 15 days of my daughter's life during which she could not experience any joy, happiness, pain, and sadness as one normally would. It was also found that during Fusako's case, there was a bit of negligence in the investigative skills, and it was found that when Fusako was actually found at the hospital, this kidnapping victim that had been missing for 9 years, who they had given up searching for long ago, the police chief of this department, who was supposed to be working her case, decided just not to show up because he was playing a board game with a fellow co-worker, and obviously didn't think it was that big of a deal, so he just didn't go in. He would actually end up having to resign from his job, as well as the co-worker that was playing the board game with him as well, because they had so much backlash for not doing their job after such a huge case was being solved. It was also said that there was a lack of communication during this whole time between the different police departments, which caused a bunch of problems in this case as well. But due to this abductor getting such a small punishment, many in the community wanted further justice, but they kind of went the wrong way of trying to get it. They began to point fingers at anyone. They wanted someone else to blame, and they started questioning neighbors of Nobuyuki's where she was being held, saying, how did you not know something was there? How did you not hear her crying and screaming? How did you not see that something was wrong? Why wasn't he ever turned in? And then the public started going after Fusako herself, saying that she could have gotten away and she should have, and it shouldn't have taken her so long to come forward. And this was because of something Nobuyuki had said at trial, and he basically was saying he always left all of the doors unlocked. She could have left at any time, but she didn't. You do have to remember she was 9 years old when she was first abducted, and she was terrified. By the time she aged, she was obedient to him out of fear, because that is how she had been raised. But even if she had been older at this time, there is a certain level of manipulation that happens in these kidnappings and with these abductors, where they will say, I didn't keep her there. I let her do whatever she wanted. She could go out of the house. But in reality, it was nothing like that at that time. There was no way they could have left the house. He told her not to run away, so she didn't. It wasn't as simple as the doors just being unlocked. I think that saying all of this about Fusako is the equivalent of blaming a domestic abuse victim for not getting away and for not just walking out. It's not that simple, and frankly, it's quite sad that these victims would be looked at as anything different than extremely strong for what they've been through. They shouldn't have to sit and question, should I have tried to get out sooner? Is it my fault? Because that's something that should never have to run through their head, and you know it's already going through their head, so the fact that people could say it and worsen those thoughts for them is truly infuriating to me. Now, I did find a new story that happened 7 years after Fusako escaped, and it's not a happy one. You see, in 2007, Fusako and her father were walking along a trail that they always did. They loved to do this together, and everything would be changed again in Fusako's life because her father would actually drown in the lake nearby and she couldn't save him. So she watched her father pass away. This poor girl has gone through so much in her life, and all that I can wish for her now is healing and peace, and I truly hope that is what she receives. I mean, to be able to stand up and tell the police 10 years after you have just been sat in silence that you were abducted and that your captor is in the room, in the hospital, that had to be terrifying. She didn't know if the police were going to believe her, if they were going to send her back to that place where she would be beaten for speaking out about it. I mean, she was terrified of him, and yet she still decided to be courageous and to speak up after so many years of being silenced. She is incredible in my eyes, but what I fear now is that this will happen again. Nobuyuki has actually already been released, and he had very little punishment, meaning he probably didn't learn his lesson. So I truly hope that somehow in some way he has healed. He has overcome his darkness. He has stopped all of this, or he stays locked up. Because I don't want this to happen to another little girl, and I don't want Fusako to fear that he is still roaming the streets. So I do hope that this survival story gave you a little strength in your heart, and that you kind of got to hear Fusako's story and her bravery, and the fact that she is an incredible human being who deserves more than most of us to be in this world and to be happy. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.